The moment that I saw this white-faced ibis, I knew that I had to draw it. It has the most beautiful iridescent feathers, and they were such a blast to draw. In this video, I am going to share a step-by-step tutorial of how I created this drawing, which will include sections of my drawing process that are 3 times the original speed, which is fast enough to keep it interesting, but slow enough to really see what I'm doing. The rest of this drawing is going to be 8 to 10 times the original speed, which is going to give you a really nice overview of the entire process. I strongly recommend that you start off by watching this video from beginning to end so that you understand what you're going to be doing with this project. Then go gather your materials, come back to the video, and follow along with me step by step. Are you ready to get started? Let's go. I started this drawing on a separate sheet of paper and I created a line drawing. When I'm working on a separate sheet of paper, I can get really messy with my proportions, and then once they're accurate, I can transfer them over. And if you're interested in more details about my drawing process, I'm going to link a video down in the notes below. Once my line drawing is transferred, I'm really focused on bringing shape and form into my drawing, and I'm not super concerned about getting every single color in just yet. So I'm coming in with a dark green colored pencil, and then after that, a dark purple colored pencil. And I'm using these pencils just to anchor in the darkest values so that I can start seeing the texture of the feathers. This allows me to focus on one thing in my drawing at a time. I'm able to see the volume and the shape and a little bit of the value by just using one color. And once I've got an area anchored in, I can come in and start adding more color. If you are doing this tutorial along with me, what I recommend that you do is get the line drawing anchored in. Then pick a small chunk of feathers and block in the value. After you have that small chunk of feathers blocked in, come in and start adding color. And the amount of colored pencil that you lay down is going to be light to medium. I don't want you burnishing. I want it to cover the white, but I don't want it to start building up thick material or even blending the colors with lots of pressure at this point. When you start adding the color, I want you to look at one feather at a time, and I want you to identify what colors you see. What are your initial impressions for that feather? And there are some really bright colors in these feathers. That can be such a great activity to really explore color in a new way. So once you identify what colors you see, I want you to lightly block those in, step back, and evaluate. You're going to be looking at pinks, magentas, blues, aquas, yellows, golds, and greens. If your color isn't spot on right away, once you start adding those browns and the other colors around it, you'll probably notice this on your own. And since you're not applying too much color, you can add another color to modify and adjust that particular feather. Now let's do the tail feathers together at 3 times the original speed. I'm coming in with the Nightshade light fast colored pencil. This is a dark violet. You could use dark violet, dark green, or another dark vibrant color. I would avoid black or brown though. Mapping in the darkest values gives me an opportunity to adjust proportions if they're off a little bit and allows me to see those feathers before I come in with color. Here I'm coming in with a light blue and a light lavender. I'm looking at my photo reference. I'm noticing that that's leaning a little bit cooler, but my initial colors were a little too cool, so I'm coming in with a darker color. Lay down initial colors, then adjust and modify. As you transition from the most bright and vibrant parts of the feather to the more neutral parts of the feather, you want these transitions to be soft and subtle. So often that means that I am dragging some of the color from the bright area into the more neutral area and vice versa. I'm also not sticking to just one color. Oftentimes I see beginners look at a photo reference like this and they go, oh, there's bright colors and then there's brown. So they grab one brown that feels close and they do everything in that brown color. And that is just not going to lead to a very accurate or interesting drawing. Instead of going just for brown, I want you to look past the color in the photo reference and ask yourself, is this a brown that is moving towards red, blue, violet, red, orange, or yellow? Did I get those all? Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet. Okay, green. Green was the one that I missed. And there's actually a lot of green in these feathers. So I want you to find those colors. I want you to actually start with those colors. Look through your colored pencil set and find a green that is a little bit more neutral, a little bit darker, and start with that. Then if you need to soften that green up, you can always come in with a brown over the top. That is going to give you a really beautiful color with lots of depth and lots of interest. Here I'm coming in with a light fast color called Wild Lavender, and it was a little bit too warm, so I'm cooling it down with a light blue. That lavender up at the top of the feather transitions to a golden color. And when I came in with a brighter yellow, that was just too bright, too intense. So I did a glaze of color over the top of it. And when I unified that entire feather with a glaze of magenta, I was able to unify the feather and help it feel like one feather all together. Now let's take a look at the other feather. In the most colorful part of this feather, I see a lot of bright pinks, magentas, lavenders, and even a tiny bit of blue. So I'm going to put magenta around the outside area, blue in the inside, and then I'm going to use lavender to transition those colors back and forth. My magenta, if I press all the way with all the pressure, is going to be too bright. So I'm mixing it with a peachy color as well, and then I'm transitioning it into browns and golds as I move towards the very edge of that feather. I'm also using a bright yellow along the edge of that feather, which I'm going to neutralize a bit, and I'm blending between the most colorful part and that yellow edge with some brown. But I'm not using the brown on its own, like I've already mentioned. That can make a really boring drawing. So I'm mixing it with violets, like I'm doing right here in the top of the feather, some neutral greens, and even some bright greens. When I focus on one area of feathers at a time, I'm able to resolve an area and really focus on it without becoming overwhelmed with the enormity of the entire project. And to be completely honest, a bird with this many feathers and rendering them in this much detail can be really overwhelming. So I strongly recommend that you treat these feathers one chunk at a time, but then constantly zoom out and look at the drawing, at the piece as a whole. So imagine you are on a journey with me. I am driving a bus or some fancy car, and I'm going to make several stops along the way. And if you are a beginner colored pencil artist, I want you to focus on the instruction that I've given you so far. Listen to the rest, but don't necessarily worry about implementing everything else that I'm going to talk about, because the next few topics I'm going to get into focus on intermediate and advanced technique. So the next stop on this journey is going to be the direction of the mark. I don't just willy-nilly throw in my color and call it a day. Instead, I look carefully at my photo reference. I try to imagine each hair of the feather, and I closely analyze what direction it's going in, and I make my colored pencils go in that direction. If the direction of the colored pencil happens to be a direction that is going to be uncomfortable for my hand, I move my paper and I move my photo reference rather than just forcing a different mark that is going to take away the depth and the texture of the subject. So what's actually happening with the direction of the mark in this part of the drawing? Well, most of the feathers are going up and down for the most part, almost vertical, but at just a slight slant. If I move my gaze over to the very right edge of the bird, those feathers are wrapping around the bird and are going in a completely different direction. So I am really articulating the difference between those with that dark shape in between the two different types of feathers. In this area, I'm still paying really close attention to color, and because I've started those other areas, I have a lot of the same colors out. And I strongly recommend that you use consistent colors throughout. So when there is a blue in another part of the drawing, I am picking up the same blue that I used before. And I can still modify and manipulate that blue a little bit, especially if the blue appears different than it does in the other part of the drawing. But if I use consistent colors, it's going to give my drawing a more cohesive look. These teeny tiny little feathers were much more difficult for me than the larger feathers, and I got overwhelmed working in these areas. So I would regularly move to other parts of the drawing and give myself a break. And that's another great reason to work in small chunks. You can move around to different areas based on your interest, your attention span, and how much time you have to work in a given session. As I finish the base layer on the body, I'm going to discuss the materials that I'm using and the materials that I would recommend for a project like this.
I'm using the 72 set of the light fast colored pencils on light fast paper. On this piece, I'm not using white a ton, but I do use it to lighten up the value in a couple areas and to also help me make sure that I have enough material built up on my paper. I'm also popping around to other parts of my drawing that I've already visited before. I'm intensifying the yellow in some of the feathers, and I'm darkening the value in some areas. Once I have quite a bit established on my drawing, I have more to refer to, so it's easier to match value and color, and that's exactly what I'm doing. I love working chunk by chunk, but that doesn't mean that I don't return back to a chunk that I've already worked on later. The goal is to get an overall impression of the color and the value for this first layer, and that doesn't mean that you have to nail it the very first pass or the very first time that you visit an area. While I finish up the body of this bird, I am going to discuss the materials that I'm using. So I've already discussed that I'm using light fast colored pencil paper. This is a really high quality, acid-free, 100% cotton smooth paper, and it's great for colored pencils, but it does come at a fairly high price point. So it's a paper that I would recommend mostly for moderate to advanced colored pencil artists. If you fall into more of a beginning category, then a Bristol drawing paper could be a really great option. These papers are less expensive. They're still great to learn on. They mimic the characteristics and the texture of a 100% cotton paper like this without coming at that really high price point. Throughout this piece, I'm using exclusively the Derwent Light Fast colored pencils from the 72 set of colors. And they come up to a 100 set of colors, which is awesome. You can just about get a light fast color pencil in any color that you want. And if you don't already know, light fastness refers to how permanent a color is going to be. So all of the colors that I'm using are going to stay true to this piece for up to 100 years, some of them even more than that, as long as I keep them under safe conditions. I don't hang it up right next to a bright window or something. I love the light fast pencils for a project like this because they keep a sharp point and are great at laying in detail. They're kind of similar to polychromos colored pencils in that way, but I feel like they lay down more material in a pass. Polychromos would be another great set of colored pencils for a project like this, and even a luminance colored pencil set could be pretty good, although they tend to be a little waxier and harder to hold a sharp point, so a little more difficult for the fine details in the feathers. If you are looking for a set of colored pencils that come at a lower price point because you're a beginner artist and you want to make sure that you like these before you really invest a ton of money into working with colored pencils, then Prismacolors can be a great option, and so could Chromic Flows by Derwent. Both of those options run at about $1.50 to $2 a pencil, or you can purchase larger packs and buy these pencils at quite a significant discount. If you're interested in purchasing new supplies, I would love it if you used my links down in the notes below. It's a great way to support the channel because I'll get a tiny little kickback at no additional cost to you. So thank you so much. Yay, it's time for the leg. And if you want to hop over to the leg earlier because you need something that's going to be quick or an easy win, that is totally an option at any point. This is probably the easiest part of the drawing. And all I'm really going to talk about here is the colors that I used. So I used a red and a white to mix up this really vibrant pink color. I probably also used some magenta in there as well. Pay really close attention to how bright that red or pink is right there on the front upper leg. There's also a little bit down at the base of the foot as well. And then those darker areas, don't jump straight to brown, just like I talked about earlier. Use a darker, more vibrant color. Here I'm using Nightshade. It's basically a dark purple. A dark green might also work, although I do think that these colors are a little bit warmer. So we're leaving the leg, which is one of the easiest areas, and moving into the head, which for me was the most difficult part of laying in a base layer for this whole drawing. And that's because I could see each one of these individual feathers, but getting the detail on each of these feathers was pretty unrealistic. So I needed to look at the photo and simplify it in my brain and then draw the simplified version rather than drawing exactly what I saw. To do this, I looked at the image, I would squint down and pay attention to patterns of the darkest shapes. Here I'm coming in with a light to medium brown and I am mapping in where I see those darkest areas. You can see a little bit of the first layer that I did coming up around the curve of the head where I just mapped in the darkest areas of those feathers, but I did it super, super lightly so that it was kind of just a guideline or a template for when I came in on the next layer. After I built up the darks and had those pretty well established, I would begin to fill in the lighter areas by going over the entire area with lighter creams, whites, and tans. And this allowed me to treat the entire head as a whole rather than individual feathers. And when the feathers are this tiny, that would be the approach I would recommend. When the feathers are larger, like the ones on the body, then I would definitely treat them one at a time because the viewer is going to organize those and look at the feathers as one object at a time, whereas we are not looking at this photograph and saying, oh, look at those individual feathers on the head. There are a couple areas where my attention is drawn to individual feathers, and that's usually because there is a darker shadow underneath the feather. So the way that I represented that on the drawing was to just make sure that I emphasized a few cast shadows underneath the feathers in specific parts of the head.
If you're enjoying this video so far, I would love it if you hit that thumbs up button. It's a great way to support the channel, and all it takes is one teeny tiny little click. Thanks so much.
That base layer of colored pencil is meant to really lay out the value, help you understand where everything goes, and to get a color mapping in so you know, okay, these areas are pink, these areas are blue. This is an incredibly important part of the process, and it is probably the thing that is most important for the rest of the drawing going smoothly. So I really strongly encourage you to take your time on this base layer. At a minimum, I would budget at least 4 to 5 hours to lay in a base layer if you're working on a piece of 9 by 12 inch paper. Everybody works at different paces, and if you happen to lay in really accurate color and proportions faster than that, then you should totally go for it. But more often than not, I see artists rushing through their proportions and their base layer, and it ends up causing them problems when it comes to laying in the final color. So take your time on that base layer. Once I was all finished, I blended with mineral spirits and I let it dry completely before coming over the top with my second pass of color. I have an entire video that walks you through how to blend with mineral spirits. That's linked down in the notes below and is a great resource if you're new to using this method of blending. The only things that I'll mention in this video is be sure to keep specific areas clean. So don't go right from a brown to a yellow because you might transfer some of that brown into the yellow when you're blending. The other thing that I'll mention is use a little less solvent than you might think on the very edges of the bird if you're leaving a white background. If you use tons and tons of solvent, or if your solvent is dirty, you can get staining around the edges of the bird, and then it kind of detracts from that nice, crisp, clean white background. Now let's slow down from 8 times original speed to about 3 times the original speed so that I can really walk you through the exact choices that I'm making on a couple of feathers. So I'm starting on this feather. I'm using a violet colored pencil and also interspersing it with a light brown colored pencil to build up the neutral areas in this feather. Here I'm transitioning it with some green, and notice how all of my marks are wrapping around. They're going from the center of the feather out and around. I'm not doing any flat horizontal shading, and that is so intentional because it's allowing me to build up the form and the volume in this feather. In my first layer of colored pencils, my application was pretty light, and now I have some areas that are light, especially if I'm glazing with like that pink and the yellow, but I'm also coming in with heavier pressure. When I'm using a white, I'm usually using that to blend, so I'm coming in with medium to even very heavy pressure in those areas. We are going for a final surface texture now. So it is okay to burnish and blend, especially if I feel like the color is right where I want it. Here I'm using the white to, again, burnish that area, and I am using it to emphasize the direction and the texture in that feather. Probably my favorite thing about this photo reference that I took was the sheen and the iridescence of the feathers. And that can kind of be a challenging texture to achieve with colored pencils. So I want to talk about some of the things I focused on for that. Here in the brightest part of this particular feather, I am using magentas, blues, and lavenders, but I am blending and transitioning them very strategically. I am hitting it with blue, then I am going over the top with a lighter blue to make sure the value is just right. Then I'm blending that blue into the magenta I already have with the lavender. I'm going back and forth to really make sure that the transitions in color are seamless. Here the feather's actually ending, and I am emphasizing that by creating a cast shadow. You'll notice throughout the entire drawing, I typically have pretty strong cast shadows underneath the feathers. And in this area where the feathers are the largest, I am treating them one at a time. I really want them to stand out from each other. And a big part of that comes from really strongly emphasized cast shadows. I finish up this feather with a little bit of glazing to unify that entire area, and then I'm moving on to the other feather. I start with the center line just to kind of make sure my proportions are on, and then I'm looking at the edge where I see that little halo of aqua coming through. I put more aqua than I need to on. I transition it with that green, and then I neutralize and blend that color out with some deep, dark lavenders, some browns, and then I even bring a little bit more warmth into it with yellow. The pressure on most of this is medium, with the yellow being a little bit heavier. Here I'm coming in with a medium amount of pressure with this magenta, but it's a little bit too strong and intense. So I neutralize it with a lavender, and then I play around with magenta glazes. A glaze is a transparent layer of color, so I'm applying that really lightly, a really, really light hand that just glides over the top. And then I can come over and burnish it with a yellow or a white to really push all those pigments together. This gray isn't something that I use a ton in this piece. You wouldn't think so with such bright colors, but it's a great way to neutralize the color if it went a little too bright and a little too dark. That gray brings it back, brings it more towards the center line. Look at how much of a bright white line I'm able to create with that light fast colored pencil. And I really feel that blending with solvent before can really help that. I've also had much more luck with white over other colors with the light fast pencil on light fast paper. So if you are looking for results like that, definitely check out that combo. When that line was a little bit too thick, I came in with some darker colors and I trimmed it up so that it was really just that little razor sliver of white between the two chunks of feather on either side. As I build up the rest of the color and the texture on this feather, I am paying really close attention to the direction that those individual hairs are moving. Now there's that main center line or shaft, and then each of these little individual hairs grow out of that, and they are going in a very specific direction. My pencil is always moving in that direction, and although I'm not drawing each hair individually, I am giving the sense of the direction of those hairs by always maintaining uniformity and specific direction with my strokes. And over here on the right side of this feather, they are moving down and around. The colors that I'm using on the rest of this feather also mimic the colors that I've been using everywhere else. This allows me to maintain a sense of harmony while still really focusing on the things that make this feather unique. So the pinks, the lavenders, the blues, that is all really similar to the way that I built up the other feather. But now some of the shapes are a little different. Some of the values might be tweaked just a tiny bit. And I find that very specific place in this feather by going back and forth with tons and tons of layers. If you avoid heavy pressure and instead stick to light layers, you are going to have so many opportunities to adjust your drawing as you build up the color and the texture in each and every feather that you draw. Right now, I am coming in with bright yellow, and then I adjust it with this magenta color, which softens the yellow and helps transition it to the brighter pink area near the center line. Lighter value colors are going to help me lighten up that color if it was too dark to begin with. But if I go too light or it loses some of the intensity, I can glaze over it again with lavender, magenta, sky blue, you name it. To achieve softness in your transitions between colors, I want you to pay really close attention to the shapes that these colors take up, but to not draw too much attention to the edges. When I am working on the pink shape of this feather, I am dragging the pink into the brownish green part of this feather more than I think I need to. Then when I'm working on the brownish green part, I drag it into the pink part a little bit, lightly fading it into the other color. Fading these colors back and forth and manipulating the amount of pressure that I put down is the best way to achieve a gradient in a feather or in an object like this. This part of the video is sped up and zoomed out, and I'm doing that for a very particular reason. It's so important to make sure that you are regularly analyzing this piece as a whole, because your viewer is going to look at it as a whole. They're not going to zoom into one individual feather and check each individual feather one at a time, the way that you might have been creating it. So every 20, 30, 50 minutes, step back and make sure that the feather you just drew makes sense with the feathers around it. As you constantly look at your photograph and your drawing from a distance, you're going to notice patterns. Look at the photo reference. Do you see how the lightest, brightest part of the body is creating this arced line that moves across the form of the bird? I want to make sure that those brightest pinks and brightest blues form that same shape in my drawing. If it doesn't, it might throw off the sense of light, the sense of form, and the sense of depth. And that might not have been something that I would be aware of or I noticed if I didn't take the time to carefully analyze my photo and my drawing as a whole. In addition to setting timers to force you to get up and look at your drawing in a new way, I also recommend that you ask friends and family members for feedback, or that you take your drawing into the bathroom or into your bedroom and look at it as its reflection. So that's you holding your drawing up to the mirror and then you looking at the mirror as a reflection of your drawing. Does that make sense? So that's a great way to just look at the drawing in a new way. Okay, here I want to talk about what I'm doing here, because I'm now working on different feathers that are doing different things. And I'm starting by creating the negative space, the darkest parts of this area. I'm mapping that in with a dark violet. And now the positive shapes, those hairy, fluffy feathers, are starting to stand out in contrast to that darker shape. I'm also doing that with the smaller feathers that are growing downward right next to it. I'm mapping those in with the darkest values so that they can start taking on the shape. And then once they have that shape, I can build up the color one layer at a time, knowing exactly where it's supposed to be. There are a lot of things that I do the same between the big feathers and the little feathers. In both of those situations, I am looking for the overall general shape first. I'm working with gradients and I'm using really similar colors in both of these sets of feathers and throughout the entire body. But I'm doing a couple things differently as well. In these feathers, I'm not really seeing a center line, and I'm also not looking at them as individuals in quite the same way that I did when I was working on those bigger feathers towards the tail. Instead, I am looking for general shapes, patterns, and I am working on softening the edges. If a feather really does stand out, I'll go ahead and map in a cast shadow and really make it pop. But if I look at my photo reference and I have to work pretty hard to see individual feathers, I am going to really soften that area up. Here I am adding those light highlights into that fluffy feather area on the edge of the body. And I'm using a really sharp white, light, fast colored pencil, drawing right over it. Now, sometimes it does turn into a lavender color because it picks up some of that really dark purple. And it's important to be okay with that being a possibility. If you don't love the lavender in your drawing, you'll want to go with maybe a brown or a green. I like that look, and so I'm fine with it. But once you put a ton of pressure into an area like that and it mixes around a bit, it is probably going to be fairly permanent, and I probably won't be able to get that area a ton lighter. But I can make it look lighter by making the background behind it darker. And I've done this already, but you probably noticed that it wasn't just white. I came in with a little bit of dark green along the edge to really soften that area. And that's an important thing to notice. If something is light, it might not be white. It might be a lighter version of the colors around it. And so it's really important to do some comparisons when you are analyzing, measuring, and then rendering the value. Here in the tiny little feathers, I'm kind of treating it like an abstract painting even. I'm looking at each of the chunks of color as abstract shapes in my photo reference, and then I'm just trying to replicate it over in my drawing. I'm not even thinking about them really as feathers anymore. Instead, I am just trying to replicate what I see. And oftentimes, disassociating what you see and what you think it should look like can make your drawings look more accurate and more realistic. And if you have a really hard time playing these mind games with yourself, you can physically force yourself to do it by flipping your drawing and the photo reference upside down. And it forces you to stop thinking about it as an actual familiar object and instead really focus on the color, on the shapes, on the relationships. I'm about to finish up the whole body, and I'm moving into another area that's a little different than the other areas I've looked at already. This area doesn't have as much color, and again, the transition between the feathers is a much softer transition. So I do start by articulating each individual feather with a darker color so that I can anchor in the shadow shapes and the cast shadows. Then I start blending with browns and grays. These colors are going to be much more dominant than the brighter colors, but that doesn't mean that I don't use the brighter colors at all. Here I'm bringing in aqua colors, really light, bright blues, and then I'm neutralizing them and softening them with a glaze of brown or gray over the top. I'm still using the colors that I used in those really bright, vibrant feathers. I'm just using them in a smaller quantity, and I am blending them out with more neutral colors even more. This allows me to stay consistent with a color scheme and to not create a part of the drawing that doesn't seem to belong with the rest of it. I'm moving into a new part of the bird. We're looking at a new part of anatomy, the base of the neck, but I am using a technique that I've already used before. Does it look familiar to you? Where have you seen this before? This is the technique that we used on the edge of the chest, and I'll put a timestamp right here so that you can go back and check that out for a little bit more information if you want to review it. I started with the negative space, the darker shapes. Then I came in over the top with a bright white colored pencil, and I very clearly articulated each individual hair, which helped me build up the texture. I went back and forth between anchoring out the negative space and creating the dark, then going over the top with white. If the white was too bright for that area, I glazed it down, but I started with white even if I knew it was going to be too bright, because it's a way of bringing value back into an area that might be a little bit too dark already. If you are a detail-oriented person like me, then coming in and working on these feathers that all seem to blend together, but that you can still kind of see as individual feathers in the photo reference, might be the most challenging part. Here I am doing just as much simplifying and generalization as I am working on fine details, which can be a really big shift in mindset when I'm working on my final pass of color. I am using really sharp colored pencils. I'm looking at general shapes of dark and light, and I am leaning into patterns rather than individual details. Here is a brand new tool that I don't use a ton, but I love it. It's an electric eraser. This one is by Derwent. It's probably the best one that I've used, although I haven't tried every single one. And you'll notice that it actually removes the colored pencil in a way that a kneaded eraser eraser or a vinyl eraser just wouldn't do. You hold the electric eraser like a pen, you press a little button, and then you apply a small amount of pressure. Now, it's not going to do little fine lines like whiskers, but it does pull out the color so that I can go in and refine and adjust the shapes of the feathers. And this was such a saving grace for me on this piece. What color do you see when you look at the photo reference of the beak? Most students say, oh, that looks white, but maybe a little bit darker. When you go looking for a color to draw in the beak, what I want you to ask yourself is, okay, so maybe it looks white to me, but is it a white that's closer to red, orange, yellow, green, blue, or purple? And when I looked at it, I answered that question with blue and purple. Then, after answering that question, I grabbed some of the blues and purples that I had already used in my piece, predominantly in those brighter feathers along the side of the body. And I used those blues and purples so that the beak is cohesive with the rest of the body. This is a fun area where you can bring a little bit more color and personality into your piece, and you can really show your own artistic style and voice. Now that the head and the beak are finished, we're moving on to the leg, and it is probably the easiest part of the whole drawing. I'm using magenta, red, and dark violet to lay in the base layer. I am neutralizing it with a grayish violet color, and then I'm even adding a little bit of brown to continue to soften that violet and to blend it into the red. I put the white highlights around the leg in a very specific angle, and this is called cross contour. You can see a tiny bit of this in the photo reference, but I exaggerated it to make the leg look three-dimensional. And you can do this in flowers, in portraits, all kinds of different subjects. And if you would like to learn more about cross contour, how I use it to make things look three-dimensional and how you can use it, please let me know in the comments below. I would love to include this in a future video if it's something that would be interesting to you. If you've really enjoyed this full-length video tutorial and you would like more full instruction from me, I'd love it if you checked out my online course, Introduction to Classical Colored Pencil Painting. There's a free preview down in the notes below. You can check out a whole module of the course and see if it's a good fit for you. There you'll learn about shadow shapes, blending with colored pencil on a sanded paper, and you'll be able to see the entire process at real-time speed.
Once you finish your drawing, I would love to see it. So be sure to reach out on one of my social media channels and let me know how your project went. I also need a little bit of feedback from you. I think that this piece is done, but I'm not 100% sure, and you guys always give the best feedback. My concern at this moment is the white background too stark? Does it need the shadow underneath? Does it need a color or something in the background? Or is it perfect just the way it is? Please let me know down in the comments below. I so appreciate your input. Thank you so much for watching all the way till the end. Until next week, I hope that you enjoy this video. Now go have a creative and curious rest of your day. Bye.